Good evening, everyone. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here, and I'm fortunate to also oversee our Smart Women, Smart Power initiative. We're so pleased today to welcome former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, for what's sure to be a great conversation about her experiences and America's role in the world. First, I want to give you a reminder to follow us on Twitter. We are at Smart Women, and be sure to check out, our Smart Women podcast, which Apple named one of the best of 2015. It's Smart Women iTunes U is the course. If you're live tweeting this event, and we hope you are, throw in some hashtags at SWSP and at CSIS, or hashtag, CSIS Live. Just for a bit of safety housekeeping, in the extremely rare case of an emergency, you can see their exits behind you. I also have some behind me, and you'll just follow me. If a fire alarm or something goes off, I will tell you which way to go. Our Smart Women, Smart Power series would not be possible without the support of Citi. Citi has been helping us to amplify the voices of women in foreign policy, national security, and international business. And I'd like to welcome up to the stage Candy Wolf, who's the Executive Vice President and Head of Global Government Affairs at Citi.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank all of you for coming tonight. This is the first event in 2017 for our series. And Citi couldn't be more proud to sponsor these events because it brings so many extraordinary women together, leaders in foreign policy, as Kathleen said, in national security, and in the business community. And we couldn't be more thrilled to have Secretary Albright with us here today as the first female Secretary of State and a champion of democracy and human rights around the world. Kathleen's going to further introduce the Secretary, but I was honored to hear her speak almost a year ago at Citi's Citi Women's International Day event in London, and she was speaking to a number of our colleagues, and the audience of all ages were just greatly impacted by her comments, and she's viewed as such a pioneer for women interested in foreign policy. And at Citi, we're present in over 100 countries, and our unique global presence aids us in recognizing the challenges of operating in an uncertain and unpredictable world. And with that in mind, we are so pleased to have Dr. Albright here to share her insight into some of those most complex world problems. We look forward to what is a lively and a timely discussion today. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Hicks to introduce Secretary Albright.
Thank you very much to Candy, and thank you, of course, to Citi for your support. Our guest this evening truly does not, you hear that a lot, but truly does not need an introduction, so I will try to make it brief. Madeleine Albright served as the 64th Secretary of State, the first woman to hold that position. During her time as Secretary, she was a strong advocate for human rights and democracy, and of course reinforced America's alliances around the world. Prior to serving as Secretary of State, she also served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Today, Secretary Albright is chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group and chair of Albright Capital Management, a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and a member of the Defense Department's Defense Policy Board. She is very busy, and we're so happy that she took some time out to spend it with us this evening. As always, our moderator is CSIS Senior Associate Nina Easton, who is also chair of Fortune's Most Powerful Women International Summit and the co-chair of the Fortune Global Summit. Again, thank you all for joining us, and over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Kath, so much, and thank you again to Citi for making all of this possible, and thank you, Secretary Albright, for being here. It's such an honor to be with you once again on stage. I want to remind everybody that, especially this is such a timely, interesting period for the Secretary to be appearing, we do want to include you. So there are cards where you can write down questions. I will collect them halfway or so through the interview, and we'll ask as many as we can include. I know a lot of people want to hear from you, Secretary.
Well, I want to thank Kat for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows.
I saw you at CVS and Chevy Chase the
That's
other
true,
day.
you did,
I
yes.
did, yeah.
But there was not long ago, I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." I said, "Well, at the Container Store." And then as I go through the magnetometer, a TSA guard looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, it's you. I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're welcome in Bosnia, and can I have my picture taken with you?" So we did that. The line got all screwed up. I went back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle said, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State," and she said, "Of Bosnia?" So thank you.
Well, I don't think that's a problem here, even when you are shopping at CVS. So, Madam Secretary, let's start by acknowledging that these are difficult times and quite a difficult transition. But as you were saying back when we were chatting a few minutes ago, it would have been difficult no matter who was elected president.
I do believe that, because what's been going on, first of all, I was the last Secretary of State of the 20th century and the first of the 21st. The problem was I started saying that kind of 6 months after President Clinton named me, which was presumptuous that he would keep me the 4 years.
Yeah.
Well, he did, and so I am. But what we were talking about at that stage was kind of building bridges to the 21st century. The 20th century had been the bloodiest century of all time, and trying to figure out how to deal with what were global trends even then. So I've kind of talked about two megatrends and their double-edged sword aspect of it. So globalization is a word that we've now all gotten used to, and basically there have been lots of advantages of it in terms of capability of traveling around the world and having business in different places, and students from a variety of cultures, and the positive aspects of it. The downside of it is that it's faceless. And so people kind of feel lost within that. And so people group more and more by identity, whether it's linguistic or religious or ethnic, which is fine. We all want to have an identity. The only problem is if my identity hates your identity, then it creates all kinds of conflict. And I think that patriotism is a good thing. Nationalism is very dangerous. And hyper-nationalism is something that is definitely out there that we'll probably talk about more, but is part of the downside of globalization. The other megatrend is the growth of technology, which has been unbelievable in terms of things that the rapidity that people can connect with each other all over the world. For instance, a good example always to talk about is a woman farmer in Kenya who can pay her bills with a mobile phone instead of walking many miles to do it. So that's the upside. The downside of it is that it has disaggregated voices. And so people have their own way of talking to each other, or how they get their information. I happen to believe in political parties, but if voices are disaggregated, then people are also disaggregated politically, and so that's the downside of it. And we've seen it, for instance, in Egypt. I've talked about how do you get from Tahrir Square to governance, especially since Tahrir Square was a social media aspect. And the truth is that elections were called too soon in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood was organized, and the other parties were not. Now, I stole this line from a meeting that I went to in Silicon Valley, so it's definitely plagiarized. But what has been happening is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technologies. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. So there is no faith in institutions. So what we're dealing with now is many more people participating in a system and no faith in institutions. And we are in a completely different system. Now, I went to college sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire, and so I have kind of learned an awful lot of different institutional things. All that is different. What works? There's the questions about the UN and the EU and then national governments, and so there is this kind of disquiet because of the positive and negative parts of the megatrends.
Do you have a more positive or optimistic view about how this is going to play out?
Well, I'm often asked whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And so I think that there are questions as to how is the system going to correct itself, who are the players in it, and particularly worried about what the role of the United States is. And how does the U.S. play within this kind of disorganized system? I happen to believe in the importance of American leadership. And President Clinton said it first, but I said it so often, we are the indispensable nation. Now, there is nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It just means we need to be engaged. And it's something that we talked about during the Clinton administration, primarily so that the American public would understand why we have to be engaged, because that's not cost-free to have the U.S. engaged, but it's also not cost-free for us not to be engaged. And Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and ends in an ism, but it is just partnership. And so that's the question as to what is America's role, who are our partners, what are our national interests?
So you have this great love of this country that was, and I've heard you speak about this before, that was really born from your family's refugee status and coming here. Your family was a refugee from the Nazis and a refugee from the communists. And you ended up here. And I know that we're facing very difficult questions about refugees right now, which I want to ask you about. But tell me about your personal refugee experience.
Well, during World War II, I was very young. My father
You were barely born.
Yeah, right. That's true, actually. So what happened was my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and we were in England with the government in exile, and basically as refugees, because there was a real question about the recognition of the government in exile, because the British did not want to rescind the Munich Agreement. So that was a big question. We spent the war in England, in London. I was in London during the Blitz, in not an air raid shelter, but the cellar of the house, the apartment building that we lived in before Notting Hill Gate got to be fancy. Then after the war, my father went back to Czechoslovakia, was chief of staff at the Foreign Ministry, and then was made the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. So I got, the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport. That's what I did for a living. What then happened was he was a professional diplomat, and his time was up. In terms of being in Belgrade, and so he was asked to be the Czechoslovak representative on a new commission of the United Nations to deal with Kashmir, the problem of India and Pakistan, and he wanted to do that. And then the communists took over, but he didn't want to work for the communists. And so his best friends in Belgrade were the British and American ambassadors, and they said, if you resign, they'll name some communist and nothing will happen. So what you need to do is to just report to our government, and so because we need something to happen. So he did that, and then we came to the United States. I don't have a tragic story of crawling through barbed wire. We came on diplomatic passports. But when my father got here, he defected and asked for political asylum. And so we became what at that stage was called displaced persons, which really was stateless and refugees. And a very different experience. By the way, at that stage, the Rockefeller Foundation was finding jobs for Central European intellectuals or something, and they found him a job at the University of Denver. We had no idea where Denver was.
I'm sure.
Started driving across America.
Yeah.
But what happened, and my father used to talk about this all the time, which was that when we were in England during the war, people were very nice, and they said, your country has been taken over by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you, and when are you going home? When we came to the United States, people said, we're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you, and when will you become a citizen? And he said that is what made America completely different from every other country. And I did become, when I started in college, I was still a foreign student. I became a citizen while I was in college in 1957. And I have renewed my vows any number of times. And one of the things that gives me the most pleasure is going to naturalization ceremonies and handing people, I can't swear people in because I'm not an officer of the law, but I can give them their naturalization certificate, and I've said to them, this is the most important document you will ever have. I have exactly the same one. Keep it safe. And I think that is what has made us remarkable. And I heard this one man saying, can you believe that a refugee would get a naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State? And I said, can you believe that a refugee became Secretary of State?
Yeah.
And that is what this country is about.
And
Which is
please,
why I'm
everybody,
wearing,
yes. And I do want to point out the Secretary is also famous for her pins, and please note what she's wearing.
the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
So obviously refugees, immigration is in the news and very charged right now, and you've been public about your opposition to the administration's actions on refugees. You signed a letter just today. But there is this sort of a squaring of national security concerns with wanting to be open to refugees, as your experience was. Talk about that.
Well, I do think that what has happened is when people operate on the fear factor, I think terrible mistakes are made. One could say the war in Iraq was as a result of fear factor. And so I think that there are issues. There's no question. We are operating in a very different world where there are terrorists, and trying to figure out who they are and where they're coming from is something that our intelligence agencies do in cooperation with others. And there really has been the most incredibly horrific aspect of refugees coming out of what's happening in the Middle East. And whether one looks at what's happening in Europe and how people are drowning or being smuggled out and paying a lot of money and trying to figure out where they can live and how they can be received. And the stories are dreadful. They really are, I think, just in terms of a humanitarian way. Even during the previous administration, I had said a number of times, it's very hard for the United States to tell everybody what to do if we're not generous in opening our shores. And I have traveled across this country many times. It's a very big country, and we have a lot of room. And I do think that it can be proven that refugees make very good citizens and work very hard. One of the things that happened during the UN General Assembly in the fall was President Obama had held a conference, first at the White House dealing with refugees, and then went up to New York to see what other countries would contribute and bring refugees in. So it's an international problem, but the U.S. has to play a part in it.
But do you believe and agree that the vetting procedures could be stronger, or do you think they're strong enough?
I think they're very strong. I think if people look at the number of steps that are part of the vetting procedure now, they're very rigorous and take a very long time. Include a number of departments and Homeland Security and the Justice Department and the people in the embassies abroad that do a lot of interrogating and sharing intelligence information. It takes a month to a couple of years. So the vetting system, I think, has been very rigorous. There have been times where there has been a question as to whether there was enough manpower to fulfill all these things. So I don't think there needs to be this extreme vetting. But I think that the problem is that we haven't, I think that what has bothered me about this is that the Trump administration seems to have been unprepared for an executive order like this, in which there was not any kind of consultation with the departments that were really involved, so that Homeland Security could talk to the TSA people to kind of prepare them for the onslaught and various aspects on that. So the unprepared, which I think, if I might say, kind of reflects generally how the transition has worked, and unprepared on it. Then the unintended consequences of this decision in terms of the number of people coming in, the mayhem that was created, but also what worries me now is retribution, the tit for tat out of the 7 countries that have been chosen, how they are now going to treat Americans that come. So for instance, Iraq is one of those countries. We have troops in Iraq. So how is the Iraqi government now going to react to all of this? And then I think really and a lot of unsubstantiated facts that have gone on about it. So I think it is one of a really badly handled operation that has disquieted our own people, that has made those coming in. Some of the stories are truly horrendous, but then also, what does this do? What is the ripple effect internationally? And we have cut the number of people that we're going to take, and so then how, again, to go back to how can we tell the Germans to take more, the Greeks or the Hungarians or whomever? And I think that is what's it's the unintended consequences of a decision that I think was not thought through well enough.
So you touched on unpredictability, but you and I were talking backstage about unpredictability can actually be useful in foreign policy at times. You mentioned the Nixon administration. Just give some examples of where unpredictability is good.
First of all, I think that I teach, and I teach a course. I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And my course is called the National Security Toolbox. And we look at, there are not a lot of tools in that toolbox, frankly, even for the most powerful country in the world. So there's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. There are the economic tools, kind of the carrots, which are trade and aid, and sanctions and embargoes, which are the sticks. Then the threat of the use of force, law enforcement, and intelligence. That's it. So one of the aspects about bilateral diplomacy, for instance, is that it sometimes pays, President Nixon was unpredictable at times in terms of the way that he dealt with the Russians, but I think that consistent unpredictability is dangerous, because countries really do need to know what the behavior of the most powerful country in the world is, so that they can set up their national interests and foreign policy to react to it. So what I have been concerned about is that, and disruption is not bad for bureaucracies. Everything that's ever been written about bureaucracy is true. But I think occasionally some kind of disruption is good. Destruction, however, is dangerous. And it's very hard to tell kind of where this is going in terms of trust of people in the bureaucracy. What are the processes? We're not a new country. We have had a decision-making process for over 200 years. And so I've told my students that we need to look at and be open to new ideas and new decision-making processes, but you do not want to be unprepared or the unintended consequences, and you don't want it to be based on untrue facts.
So let's talk about some of the countries that are front and center. Russia. And of course you have a pin for Russia, which is a bug, because you were bugged by the foreign minister back in...
Well, the thing that happened was that the Russians were bugging a room on the 7th floor of the State Department where the Secretary's office is, and we finally found the man sitting outside listening to us, and we did what you do in diplomacy, is do a démarche, which is let Moscow know that this is wrong. But then when I met with the Russian foreign minister, I did wear a huge bug, and he knew exactly what it was about.
Did he get it?
He got it.
So what is your take on Putin and his motives in the world today, particularly when it comes to Syria, but also when it comes to Europe? I think you have an interesting theory that pieces it all together.
Well, first of all, I used to be known as a Soviet expert. I know. I now kind of look at my library and I thought, archaeology. Yeah. No, actually. And I think that it's very important to kind of understand what the history has been of a country that was an empire, and also the Soviet Union which had an incredible amount of influence and power and was our major adversary. We were asked to do something at the end of the Cold War that's never been done before, which is how to devolve the power of your major adversary without a war. And so there were any number of ways that we were dealing with the Russians, trying to figure out how to work with them, because you have to have a functional relationship. You're not going to agree on everything, but you need to really figure out where you can agree and where you have to disagree. And our thought was that it would be good to have them be part of a system, not on the outside. I actually had a meeting with Yeltsin he said, why are you expanding NATO? And I said, it's not against you, and at some point if you want to join, you're welcome. So it was not a matter of disrespecting them, it was a matter of trying to figure out how to work with them. And by the way, when I became secretary, the man that was foreign minister was Yevgeny Primakov, who had headed their intelligence service. And as I walk in from my first meeting, he says, given my previous job, you do know I know everything about you. But I do think we were working on a variety of different relationships. Putin comes in, and I have to say what was interesting, the first time President Clinton and I met Putin, he was still kind of acting president. We were in a meeting in New Zealand, APEC, and at that stage he was trying very hard to be ingratiating and tried to make sure that
Give us an example of Putin being ingratiating.
Well, he was kind of saying, I need to get to know better what you're doing and how we work together, etc. So then what happened was that we had a summit in Moscow, and I went to prepare it, and then we came, and it was the summer of 2000. By the way, I wasn't always a great, I have to tell this story, you were talking about my pins. So what happened was that pins got me into trouble, and then they got me out of trouble, but they got me into trouble in Russia because there was a great picture from the 50th anniversary of NATO where what happened was Secretary Bill Cohen of Defense and President Clinton and I were sitting on a sofa in the green room. And I don't know which of us did it first, but we did the hear no evil, see no evil monkeys. We looked like crazy people. It ended up as a picture in Time magazine. Anyway, so I then actually went and I found these 3 great monkey pins. So we're walking in for the summit, and President Putin looks at President Clinton and says, we always noticed what pins Secretary Albright wears. Why are you wearing those monkeys? And I actually said, because I think your policy in Chechnya is evil. And he got furious at me, rightfully so. President Clinton looked at me like, are you out of your mind? You are the chief diplomat and you have gotten us into trouble. So that's when pins got me into trouble. I can tell you how they got me out of trouble, however, which is that I invented the art of diplomatic kissing. You can't visualize Kissinger coming in and giving a big hug to somebody or whatever. Anyway, much more complicated than meets the eye, because some Latins kiss on the right cheek and some on the left cheek, and a lot of bump noses, and then the French kiss twice and the Dutch 3 times, so big embrace. Anyway, I arrive in South Korea, big embrace, very good meeting. I then leave, and I get a phone call from a journalist saying, don't you think the foreign minister of South Korea should resign because of what he said about you? And I said, well, what did he say? And he said, well, I love it when Secretary Albright comes because we're about the same age. But I'm this tired old man, but when I embrace her, she has very firm breasts. So what do you have to say about that? So I said, I have to have something to put those pins on. But anyway, to get back to Putin.
Off the top of your head, you're fast, quick-witted.
To get back to Putin.
Yes.
What did happen?
Speaking of chess,
is that he is very smart, and it's very interesting because in meetings, most leaders have some kind of talking points in front of them.
Yeah.
He did not have talking points. He did all that, but he took notes in terms of what President Clinton was saying to him. And you could see, very much back and forth in terms of sheer brain power. And then he wanted to be charming later at put on a jazz concert. And Clinton could never sit still, but Putin is sitting there like that. And it was not a great summit, generally. What is interesting is to watch him now. And I think that he is a KGB officer. That is what he is. And he has played a weak hand very well. And what he wants is, in the early 90s, I did a survey of all of Europe in terms of how people felt after the fall of the wall. And we had very fancy questionnaires, but we did focus groups and things. And I'll never forget a focus group we had outside of Moscow where this man stands up and says, "I'm so embarrassed. We used to be a superpower and now we're Bangladesh with missiles." And what has happened is that Putin has kind of bought into that identity crisis to bring Russia back as a power. And that is what's made him popular. Kind of, we are back, a nationalist kind of sense about it. And so he is watching various places where he can have an influence. And he's very suspicious of NATO. He wants to break up Europe in many different ways, and he is using asymmetrical warfare, as we call it, in terms of little green men in Ukraine, or cyber propaganda, a number of different things, and using his influence because he sees a united Europe as a danger to them, and he wants to have a sphere of influence.
And his intervention in Syria, you see playing into that as
Definitely.
well.
I mean,
Explain
part
that.
of the issue is that Russia, or the Soviet Union, did have influence in the Middle East in a number of different ways. And then that disappeared, and what he's wanted to do is to get back into having influence in the Middle East, but also he is concerned. I do think one of the aspects of diplomacy is you try to find what you have in common with another country. They are also afraid of terrorists, there's no question, in terms of their sense about the Chechens or any number of people. They have very large Muslim population, so they are concerned about terrorist activity and ISIS itself. So he found a common goal with the United States in that, and he has played that very well in terms of having an influence again in the Middle East by supporting Assad, but being helpful initially on getting rid of the chemical weapons. So
Right.
he is very smart.
And producing flows of refugees that...
And what he has done, he has weaponized the refugees in many ways. He's created this outflow that is destabilizing a lot of the countries in Europe. So he's accomplishing a lot in that particular way.
If you were negotiating with him right now, what would be the key to getting the better of him in your mind?
Well, I think it is not easy, frankly. I would try to make clear that we are not going to remove sanctions because they are not fulfilling their obligations. The question is how you make them be a legitimate player within the international system. The United States wants to have partners, and there are things that we can cooperate on, whether it's fighting piracy or climate change or any number, nuclear proliferation issues, how to find those. And I think that what I would do is obviously treat him with respect, but I also would make very clear that invading another country, i.e. Ukraine, and taking Crimea is illegal, and for that there is a punishment, and that he has to fulfill those Minsk Accords. And the hard part really is how to negotiate. I mean, there was a summit I went to in Warsaw, and it was a NATO summit, and they were talking about the importance of NATO as a deterrent, but also as a form of dialogue. And I often say it's kind of like trying to do that. It's not simple to maintain both things, but that is the art of diplomacy. So I would look for areas where one can work with Putin, but he respects strength. And I think that means that there are times we have to push back, and being liked is not what is necessary here.
And do you think there's an expectation out of Moscow that these sanctions will come off?
I don't know. I mean, this is whether the intelligence, who's listening to what, I don't know. I think that there are those who believe that that is something that the Trump administration wants to do. And there are some who think that there's some Europeans that might want to go in that direction. So I think, but also I do think that Putin and his people are, to go back to the refugees, are in fact really creating that through their own propaganda. So they're much better at propaganda than we are, believe me.
They're good at it.
And we can never forget that he's a KGB officer.
Right.
And so we are operating mostly in terms of openness and on the level, and they are operating in another sphere. And so I think that other presidents have made a mistake about him. President Bush saying, I looked into his eyes and trust him. And so I think that we need to be exceptionally careful and not be kind of seduced by mutual admiration society.
So another major global figure, Xi Jinping. What was your reaction to his I am the force of globalization in the world speech?
Well, he is a fascinating character. And I've gone to China a lot, and I met him before he was in his exalted role. He was vice premier, and then when he came to the United States as vice premier, what was interesting is he wanted to have a meeting with I call former people to see
The formers.
The formers, and Henry Kissinger was there. By the way, I always say meeting with the Chinese with Henry Kissinger is like going with a demigod, and somebody said, forget the demi. I mean, they really treat him in a very different way. But what was interesting what Xi Jinping did in that particular meeting was to say, what did you all learn from the 35 years since normalization in terms of our relationships? And then he made a big point in that meeting of saying how he had admired and understood America because he had spent some time in Iowa and felt that he had a relationship. So I think the fact that President Trump is, as I understand it, going to name the former governor of Iowa to be the ambassador to China is very smart.
That's interesting.
Because that personal relationship. So Xi Jinping, I do think that the basis of his power is that there were less than exciting Chinese leaders before. He is also playing the nationalist card by saying that in fact China was not respected properly through many parts of the early 20th century and even before that, that they are a major power, need to be respected, and that he in some ways is going to reverse that. And he has done that in many ways by playing more and more internationally. One of the things when I was in office, we never could get the Chinese to really participate in discussions at the UN unless it had something to do with interference in internal affairs. So for instance, we got to be such good friends with people that you see all the time on the Security Council that I gave the Chinese permanent representative a little blue ball so he could practice being strong and raising his hand to vote. And then we wanted them to be involved in some of the regional activities. And now they are taking it much further in terms of global. I do think what was fascinating was Xi Jinping in Davos, where all of a sudden he is the apostle of globalization and of capitalism in some kind of a weird way. And he sees, and a lot about world power is where there are vacuums, somebody fills it. And so he is pushing that, and I think it's going to be very interesting in which direction it goes. I think the most important, I know we talked about Putin, but I think the most important relationship is the one with China.
And where do you see that heading?
Well, I thought it was heading, one of the things I have to say is I have met with a lot of Chinese over the years, and I even said this to them at some point, which was that to disregard what is said during campaigns, because ultimately we recognize that the Chinese are most important power.
You've counseled them to disregard.
Well, partially because I was around when Governor Clinton said, the butchers of Beijing over what happened in Tiananmen Square, and then we're the ones that brought them into the World Trade Organization. or President Bush, who had a terrible beginning in terms of airplanes and a variety of dissonance, and then in fact they had a very good relationship. So it's kind of standard operating procedure, except now, where I think people were surprised by the phone call with the president of Taiwan, which happened after the election, and somewhat surprised probably about what we're saying about trade and pulling out of the TPP. So I think we have to see what the relationship is going to be.
Let's unpackage all of that. Taiwan, how important was that? How does that play into North Korea? Play that out for us.
Well, first of all, to go back on what we learned out of 35 years of normalization, when President Carter decided to normalize relations with China, it was accompanied by the Taiwan Relations Act, which meant that we would continue to have a relationship with Taiwan and would in fact continue to provide arms to them. That is part of the deal. But we have said we also believe in a one China policy. That is what Henry Kissinger negotiated, and it is a way that if there's any change in the status, that it has to be done peacefully. And there have been kind of rules of the road on all of that. So what happens is there are different versions of how this phone call happened, but it was kind of, to have it be so early and kind of in their face was really not helpful in the way that that's going to go. I think that we have to see we have a lot of issues with the Chinese. Some of them are trade, and some of them have to do with the South China Sea and what they're doing. But they also have been important to us in terms of having some cooperation in the region. If you were to ask what is the most threatening thing that is out there now that we have no kind of control over, it's what's happening in North Korea. It is run by somebody that is completely unpredictable, that has threatened to use nuclear weapons, that has his own issues. And we have always believed that the country that has the most influence over North Korea are the Chinese, because they are the ones that have traded with them and are neighbors and have that influence. And the Chinese haven't been eager to help on that anyway, because they don't want to see North Korea fall apart and have all those refugees come across the border. But if in fact we decide to not cooperate with them on things, then we don't have anybody that can help us enough on what is one of the most intractable issues.
But could one argue that, you know, the way things have been moving, using China as, relying on China to stop North Korea's nuclear program hasn't really been going that well, and that there is room for disruption in how we're proceeding on that? Would you?
Well, I think the question is, how do we deal with the North Koreans? And I don't want to sound too much like Professor Albright, but I talked about it this morning, and part of the issue is we have no embassy there. We have, Sweden is a protecting power for us, but we don't have a relationship with them, which is a problem. We never ended the Korean War. I don't know, I'm sure there are people here that have been to the demilitarized zone, which is the weirdest thing I've ever been to, in terms of kind of like one side looks like the side of the moon and the other is like a Hollywood movie. And, you know, and so there's that problem. The North Koreans have a 1 million-man army. We have troops in South Korea, and we have an alliance with South Korea. So all of that is incredibly complicated. We have had reviews of how to deal with North Korea a number of times. I am still the highest level sitting official to have met with a Korean leader.
Yeah, tell us about that. That was my next question. That's fascinating.
Well, the thing that happened is during the Clinton administration, there were various parts of the relationship with the North Koreans. Initially, they were threatening to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We then negotiated something called the Agreed Framework, which made clear that they do need energy, that we would be able to sell crude oil to them and help them build a light water reactor. Got very complicated, and those countries that were supposed to help us on that, the South Koreans and the Japanese, they were kind of reneging on various aspects. So At a certain stage, it got very dangerous again. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry did a whole review of how we were supposed to operate. And so in the course of that, I'm shortening this quite a lot, what happened in, again, the summer of 2000, the number 2 guy, Vice Marshal Cho, came to the United States and wanted to see about having a different relationship. And so he and I signed an agreement of non-hostile intent, that we're not intending to do anything and vice versa. When he came to see me in the State Department, he came in a 3-piece pinstripe suit. And then next day we went to the Oval Office. He was in full uniform. And he gave President Clinton a red folder in which he invited him to come to North Korea. And President Clinton wisely said, I might come at some point, but we have to prepare it, so I'm sending the Secretary of State. They were not wild about that. So, and I went, we had no idea, and our intelligence said that Kim Jong-il was crazy and a pervert. I went there, and he was not crazy.
But he was.
So I get there.
Evidence, please?
Well, I'll tell you what was interesting was that I go, and because we had no embassy, there was no way to know what I was going to do. So I'm put into the guest house, and the guest house, they're listening to you. They have cameras on you. Then the thing I didn't know is even on a laptop, just depending on what keys you strike, they can tell what you're doing. So you kind of sit there waiting for something to happen. And they said, well, first thing you have to do is go and pay respects to Kim Il-sung, the dear embalmed father. So the bottom line, there are things about diplomacy that are a little complicated, which is if you pay too much respect, then your own people criticize you. If you don't pay enough respect, then you haven't accomplished anything. Right. So I went, I must have done the right thing, because then I go back to the guest house and I'm told that the dear leader would see me. So we're going, and we have a press conference, and it was like something out of the 50s with old cameras and things. And I'm standing next to him, and I see we're the same height. And I knew I had on high heels. And then I looked at, he did too. And his hair was a great deal poofier than mine. And he just basically, his interest was a lot in Hollywood and various parties, and it was
Hollywood gossip.
No, but it was one of the most fascinating meetings I've ever had. And we did come to many agreements, frankly, in terms of missile limits and a number of different things. Some of you may remember the election of 2000, which was a little peculiar, and it was unclear who had actually won for a while. I came back to the United States with a lot of suggestions, presented them. By the way, a transition is really an interesting time in terms of, if used properly, to transfer the crown jewels. Yeah. And I briefed Secretary Powell on it. He was very interested in what might happen. He then wanted to see how to continue it. There was a headline in one of the papers said Powell to continue Clinton policies on Korea, and it was pulled by the White House. So I hold no brief for the North Koreans, but there has been confusion on it. And I think that there were times that we were closer to having an agreement. And so now with this son that we know very little about, where there's no trust, the question is who actually is the interlocutor on it, right. Which is why we get stuck with the Chinese on this, even though they don't have the same will to do it. And then depending upon what our policies are with the Chinese, whether they want to play the same game, and which frankly then means that maybe 6-party talks of the region are important with with the South Koreans and the Japanese, and then get the other neighbors into it. But I do think that we need to talk to them because they are dangerous. So
we still have a lot of territory to cover, and Bev was going to get me audience questions. Great. Let me ask you, there's so much more to drill down on North Korea, but switching subjects a little bit, Brexit. You're in the business now of advising companies. What would you advise companies in Europe about Brexit?
Well, I think that basically, and let me just say generally, we are advising companies, because there is such a lack of clarity on what our relations are everywhere, we were just talking about China, is that basically people need to stay calm and maintain their contacts in places, because it's all going to take a long time. And I believe that also in terms of what's going on in Europe. And the question will be is how bilateral treaties are negotiated, and very important in terms of understanding that there is mutual interest in treaties, trade treaties working out. So I am definitely, although I have to say this to myself every morning when I wake up, not to panic, that there are certain aspects of relationships that will be carried on once we get straightened out a little bit. But I think that it would be a mistake for the U.S. to kind of panic and say we don't. Yeah.
Now here's an interesting related question. Given that you said Russia wants to break up Europe, and the fact that Russia clearly intervened in the U.S. election, do you think there is a likelihood that Russia intervened in the Brexit vote?
I actually think yes. I think that there are various propaganda. Well, I think that part of the question is the following: is how do people get their information these days? And this goes a little bit to what I was saying earlier in terms of people having their own source of information. They listen to different things. I don't know how many of you happen to tune in on Russia Today, their propaganda machine, in terms of the way they talk about things and the way that they undermine the institutional structure of a country. I do know, or I've read, is that they have had an awful lot of putting money in to Hungary, where Orban is all of a sudden a country that had been invaded by the Soviet Union, now in terms of their illiberal democracy are good partners. There are stories about the fact that they are interfering in the French elections, and basically goes back to what I said earlier, they have a very sophisticated propaganda machine.
And let me give a quick call out to CSIS's report, The Kremlin Playbook, which is really powerful and worth reading. Yeah.
Well, I think we are dealing with intelligence agents, and I think that they do know how to kind of play the populist card, because the populist card is working for them in terms of then leading to not wanting to have anything to do with the United States, or not trusting their institutions, and moving towards leaders that then are more dedicated to illiberal democracy.
So next question.
But let me just answer, I am not sure that they played in Brexit, but if you kind of read the tea leaves on things, it would look as though they have used their propaganda machine, Russia Today, Sputnik, and a variety of different ways that they operate in social media, that this is not just something that they pick on in the United States.
Excellent, interesting, very interesting. In the information age where knowledge, even top secret information, can be divulged, do you think the U.S. needs to work to make all information known in order to control its impact? How do you feel the role of confidential information is changing in the U.S. and the world?
Well, first of all, collection of intelligence is the second oldest profession in the world. I do think that it is something that happens, and the governments do make decisions based on intelligence information. I think the problem that comes up is that a lot of discussion in confidential information is gossip. And undermines relationships in a number of different ways. So one has to be concerned about WikiLeaks, for instance, which was based on some kind of material that may or may not have been true in terms of gossip, is the only way I can put it. I do think that a government does need to have some capability of having confidential information. The question is, what happens when pieces of it are revealed and others are not? And then I think we are truly having a problem in determining what truth is. Truth is one thing. Facts, however, are facts, not alternative. And so I think that there has to be questions in terms of what the information is and how you compare the sources of information. But it is really difficult because there are different opinions in places, there are different sources, and the reason that the intelligence community itself is so important and briefings are so important is that they have a way of bringing together the various sources and offering options and looking at different ways of how interpreting things. But I think one of the biggest issues at the moment is what is the role of information in policy making, in political change. That when I was a real academic, I wrote my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press in 1968 during the Prague Spring. I wrote about the role of the press in Poland during the Solidarity period. So the question of how what's going on with information now is having an effect in political change. So, for instance, in Czechoslovakia in '68, what happened was that the people knew a lot of things through their various networking, and it wasn't until the papers printed it that people actually, that was a sign that there was going to be change. Now it's the opposite, is that people don't have the information, and the press is criticized for not, in fact, telling the truth.
For playing catch-up.
Yeah. So
that's really interesting. Another question from the audience has to do with Turkey and Erdogan, and where do you see relations with the U.S. going?
Well, I have found Turkey a fascinating country from the very beginning of my political life, and I think that it had the possibility of being a very important country in terms of its location and its capabilities geographically. I have to say, I used to love to go to Turkey. I took my grandchildren there about 4 summers ago, and my youngest granddaughter, who always has some pithy saying, said, "I understand Turkey completely now. We spent the night in Europe and had lunch in Asia." And that is really what it's about in terms of being a country in an incredible location. It is now in a very complex situation because it's a member of NATO, and at the same time it's kind of on a different side in terms of some of the things that are going on in Syria, whatever their relationship is with Russia.
Yeah.
And in terms, initially, we thought of it as a model Muslim democracy. And now it has turned into a very authoritarian state also,
Right.
and has I happen to think that the Europeans made a huge mistake by not bringing them into the European Union. As an American, I was told to mind my own business. But I think that then created a possibility for them to turn east and have a different role.
Interesting. Yeah. So I'm being told that time is running out, so I'm going to take the last question because I want to talk to you about your leadership style, and I love the fact that you've always lived life so big. And the anecdote that I love about you were ambassador to the UN, you were visiting a aircraft carrier in San Diego, and you had the option to take a jet, land on the aircraft carrier, and it was, your aides kept saying, no, forget it, it's gonna fly here, it's dangerous. I'm sure if some of you have done this, it's just a pretty scary thing. But you decided to do it. You get on, with this balancing act, you land on the aircraft carrier, and as the New York Times reported, you get out, you've got your orange jumpsuit on, your matching lipstick, matching goggles, and said, that was fantastic. And I look at you and I think, what's your kind of overall theory of life in terms of when to take risks and when to play things with caution?
I don't always do it right, let me just say. But I loved being Secretary of State. I loved representing the United States. I loved all the opportunities that came with it. And things that I never thought I would do, really, we landed, it's called tailhook for a reason.
That's what it was called, yes.
Because what happens is you are landing on the deck of a plane, and it's of an aircraft carrier, and everything is the opposite of what you think because you speed up in order to land. And so you're coming in and you're counting on this hook catching the wire. and you're kind of jerked out of your body on it. But then you spend the night on this aircraft carrier, which is huge and fantastic, and the people on it are incredible in every way. And then you take off again. And so it was a great and wonderful experience, and I'm glad I did it. But there are other things that I did that were kind of totally different, which is, nobody ever believes this, but you're asked to do crazy things as Secretary of State. So I'm brand new, and they say, you have to go to the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the last night there's always a skit by every country, and the United States does really badly. And so I said, well, I'm not going, and especially since they had just accepted Burma, and I didn't agree with that at the time. And they said, no, you've got to go. So then the State Department gave me lyrics to Mary Had a Little Lamb, and I said, I am not singing that. On the way over, we decided that I would sing Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. So I got dressed up as Madonna, and I actually did it, and people were very surprised. So that year, the Russians, my buddy Primakov, he had a perfectly dreadful skit, and all he did was have a whistle and boss around the Black Sea Fleet. So we decided that the following year we would do a duet that had never been done before. So on the margins of really important meetings, we decided that we would do our version of the West Side Story, and we called it the East-West Story. And that year, the ASEAN Forum was held in Manila, and so the night before, we went to General MacArthur's suite, and the Russians brought a lot of vodka, and we rehearsed. And then the next day, our delegations had a rumble, and then I came out singing Yevgeny, Yevgeny, the most beautiful sound I ever heard. And he came out singing Madeleine Albright, Madeleine Albright, I just heard. So I decided that I would have fun. I really did enjoy having fun. And there are lots of good stories, but I also, I think, tried to figure out what the role of the United States really is, and when you speak up and when you don't, and how you use the amazing power of the United States, and not to always tell everybody what to do, to be clear what is in our national interests, and then not be somebody that is looking for praise or importance or to make a big splash, but to remember what it is we're doing. Mm-hmm. This is a great country, and it is a country that needs to be represented with respect, and at the same time to respect other countries and their national interests. And so I think we are in a very difficult time, as we started out saying would have been difficult under any circumstances. And I think that the government itself has to sort out what American national interests are and what tools to use. And then those of us that are on the outside have to figure out what about this democracy requires us to play an active role. Mm-hmm. How we work, how we actually read the Constitution and see what the role of Congress is, and the judicial branch, and people speaking out, and the role of the media. So I think that there are a lot of issues at the moment about what the 21st century is going to look like as we get further on into it, because it is completely different from the 20th century. So leaving just final word to this audience, a lot of whom are younger people, not everybody. One piece of personal life advice. Stay calm. That works. And I'll tell you what my life advice is. Nothing in my life has ever come easily. And that one has to work. And you have to get an education, work at it, not expect, I say this to my students, not expect that you'll get an A just for showing up. Yeah. That you have responsibility to those that you work with, and actually delivering on what you have been asked to do is your resume. And so I have worked hard. I have cared about my personal relationships, but my most important advice has always been to myself, is never to give up, One of the things, one of my early report cards was, Madeline is discouraged by first difficulties. I'll never forget my father saying that to me when I was 10 years old. So I'm never now discouraged by first difficulties. Okay. And you can't expect that you're going to get something if you don't work hard. And then for women, my advice is to interrupt. Because unless you interrupt, then you're often not listened to.
Madeleine Albright, it's been such an honor. I'm going to lead the standing ovation.